Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today's session. Hope you're all having a great day. My name is Anil Ramanini, Charter Member and Executive Director of TISOCAL. Today's topic is exercising sound judgment in the heat of the moment. It's my great pleasure to introduce our moderator, Krishna Pandiala. He's an expert on the art and science of human judgment and choice making. His pioneering work on judgment quotient, or JQ, is being recognized as the third intelligence beyond IQ and EQ. He is a keynote speaker, seminar leader, and an advisor to entrepreneurs, executives, and emerging leaders. Krishna is the founder and chief empowerment officer of the Choice Ladder Institute and co-founder and president of Mindful Nation Foundation. Thank you, Krishna. Please go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Anil. Good morning and good evening to viewers all over the world. Thank you for joining us. I have an interesting panel that I tried to gather for this session, since it's vital to be deliberate and not hastily react to crises without considering the broader landscape and long-term consequences of our actions. So I gathered three different panelists, and I want to introduce each one of them. One is my good friend Prashant Ambe, who is the president of TI Pittsburgh, and who is a hardcore engineer who managed over 600 engineers during his term at ANSYS as the vice president of engineering. So welcome, Prashant. We have Dawn Rucker, who was one of the first female graduates of the Military Academy in West Point, and also an entrepreneur and an executive, currently focused in the robotic space. And I wanted to hear Dawn's perspective on exercising judgment under pressure. And last but not the least, we have Robin Prasad, who is a neuroradiologist and would kind of give you a perspective from how he sees it from the medical angle. Now, I was hoping that I would get all these people with pure backgrounds, and only after I got their bios did I realize that all four of us are engineers. So unfortunately, you're going to get that tech input whether you like it or not, but I've requested each of the panelists to keep that tech background a little bit on the side and share their perspective from their practical experience that they have dealt with. So thank you again, Prashant, Dawn, and Robin, for joining me. And we have been living in a VUCA world, and VUCA standing for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world. And that's what we've been all along. And that's before the coronavirus pandemic hit us. So the impact of the coronavirus on us is really putting these four vectors, the volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, on steroids. So given this, leaders still have to make decisions, real-time decisions, moment-to-moment decisions. So I thought I'd start off with each one of you sharing how you go about making moment-to-moment decisions, real-time decisions. So Prashant, if you want to start, we'll go with you, Dawn, and Robin, and then we'll go from there.
Good. Thank you. Thank you, Krishna, for the great introduction. I want to frame my response before I go into a little bit of detail. So we are talking about decisions that we're making where we have very little time to make those decisions, right? We're not talking about spending a couple of months, in anticipation of making a decision where you can get consensus, you can meet with your team, analyze, and then come to a final outcome. We're talking about things where you are faced with situations where speed is important and decision making in that situation. So I would categorize them into two different types of situations that fit into that frame. One is decisions that are emotionally charged, where you are really in a very high anxiety or heightened awareness, and in a state where emotion is driving everything, right? So those are the most dangerous situations, in my opinion. And I think I had been very careful to be very conscious and aware if I'm in those modes, because when you make decisions in those modes, typically your judgment is very clouded, right?
Mhm.
So I was very careful, taking a deep breath, and exercising some silence in that mode before making a decision, and try to make the best of it in that situation, but not react in an impulsive manner. So that's one situation. The other scenario is the decision is urgent, but you are not in a heightened emotional state. Rather, you are in a situation where there is urgency, but you have the calm and the poise to make a decision. In those situations, I tended to embrace uncertainty. Okay,
Mhm.
so it's not always possible to know all the factors that go into making that decision. So I tried to be aware of the consequences. I tried to be not drive the decision based on fear, right? And of
Mhm.
course, experience matters. So as they say, good judgment comes from experience, and experience comes from bad judgment, right? So learning from the past mistakes you make, and trying to use that intuition to make judgment, good decisions in that situation.
Thank you, Prashant. Don?
Well, I would start out by saying that I think most of us of a certain age would say we make decisions based on our gut. And what that really means is we make them instinctually. I think, and obviously we make decisions differently at 60 than we did at 25 or 30. But I think for me, it is a process of listening, of playing out potential scenarios, and then acting. And so I'm a person who's sort of biased to action, and I realize that many times decisions don't get better with time. They need to be made, and they need to be made in a timely manner. But this idea of making judgments under pressure is very interesting to me. So what makes this difficult for us as leaders? First, it's usually a time pressure. And so there's that crushing feeling of I have to decide something quickly. And second is the impact of the decision. And I think that speaks to the fear of making the wrong decision, right? So for me, it's an uncomfortable situation. And fortunately, I had an experience early in my life that helped me learn to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. So at the ripe old age of 17, I made the decision to enter the military. I attended the military academy at West Point. And so that young adult experience shaped me tremendously. We were all high performing people. We were all pushed to our limit emotionally, physically, in every sense. You never had enough time to do everything that was expected of you. You had to learn and memorize an incredible spectrum of silly and important information. So there was this constant crush. And many of these were people, high achieving people. So this was this very uncomfortable feeling of failing. And we failed often at many different things early in that experience. So what that taught me is you need to think beyond the moment. You need to decide what you won't pay attention to. You have to be strategic and decide what to let go. So this was my experience. It's maybe not right for everybody, but it's what shaped my early adult life. And so the recommendation I often give to entrepreneurs about getting yourself comfortable with being uncomfortable is to test yourself, do things that scare you, build that muscle inside of you. Because if you do something that scares you often enough, it becomes exhilarating and you eventually get comfortable with being uncomfortable.
Fabulous. Actually, both of you have touched on very key points. I think Prashant brought the word uncertainty, and getting comfortable with uncertainty is key, because the next topic will be about analysis paralysis, and we'll talk about that. And Don, you brought up the notion of being comfortable with being uncomfortable. So Robin, I'm curious to hear your perspective.
Sure. Much of the way I function has been colored by my experiences in medicine. So I'll draw some analogies here. And let's look at just the interpretation of a CAT scan, for example. When one interprets a CAT scan of the abdomen, there are about 100 things you're looking at systematically. And so it's composed of not just, hey, is this normal or abnormal? It's composed of a very large number of micro decisions that are happening on a moment-to-moment basis. I think that happens in life a lot as well. So if I'm using another hospital analogy, when you're sick and you go into the hospital, into the ER, the first thing you do is you go into triage. And triage decides, is this severe? Are you going to the operating room right now? You know, how soon do you need a seat? Or are you going to sit around for 6 hours and sort of wait for this? And so I approach all of these things from the standpoint of triage. Is this mission critical? If it is, I'm going to put my full effort into it. And if it's not, and I think Prashant and Dawn both alluded to this, I'm going to make those decisions fast. Someone once told me, if you're going to make a mistake, make it fast. And if it's not mission critical, you do your best, accept that uncertainty, and move on and focus your efforts on the things that really are critical. And if you put that extra, I found that when I put that extra layer of trying to understand what's really critical and what's really not, it allows me to move forward much more robustly.
Awesome. And the most interesting time I had to kind of exercise this most recently was in March when the travel ban came, and I was in Vancouver. Our son was studying abroad in Dublin, and our daughter was gallivanting over spring break in the UK. So my wife was alone at home, and soon enough, I landed in Vancouver. My cell phone was off, and when I turned it on to call the Uber, I had 7 text messages. And my wife doesn't usually send me a text. I get 1 a month. To get 7 on the same day, I knew there was a crisis. But I made the first decision was not to look at them before I called the Uber, and actually got into the Uber, because the chances of me looking at that and getting distracted and leaving one of my bags on the curb was going to be very high. So that was decision 1. Second one was, it was 11:30 at night Pacific, which is 2:30 Eastern. I said, what can I do right now at this time? Not a whole lot. So maybe I can wait till tomorrow morning. And then I looked at the text, and it was about travel ban, which I knew nothing about because I was on a flight. But there was a clue that I got in the afternoon when I was boarding my flight in Los Angeles to Vancouver. I was sitting at the gate area where there were, it was next to a sports bar that had 5 different TVs with 5 different channels. And I was watching the news in one of them where President Trump made the comment, I'm going to make a huge announcement tonight, or a big announcement tonight. I get confused between those 2 words. So then that was a clue, because in the past, you look at patterns. Every time he's made a big announcement, there has been some modification, a rollback of sorts. So I was hoping there would be a rollback. And so the initial announcement was nobody can come back into the US. So I called my wife and I said, you know what, why don't we wait till tomorrow morning? And if the news is still the same, then we'll think about what we can do, because I got to go get some rest because I have a workshop in the morning at 8 a.m. And luckily, by the time I reached the hotel and checked in and turned on the news, they had already rolled back saying US citizens and resident aliens could get back. And since both the kids are US citizens, we knew we could come back. We could bring them back safely home. So the whole thing subsided, and I didn't have to react and lose sleep over that night. So these are, I think, very good, tough times that a lot of us are dealing with, whether it's applying for aid or PPPs in the US and so on. There are a lot of different real-time decisions that we need to make. Now, the next question I want to talk about is, when you chase certainty, a lot of people, especially high achievers, don't want to make mistakes. So when you don't want to make a mistake, you're really looking for certainty. And when you chase certainty, you tend to get into analysis paralysis. So I'm curious how each one of you has dealt with analysis paralysis. And before you answer that question, I just want to remind the audience that we will take questions in the chat. So go ahead and put any questions that you may have in the chat, and we'll handle them at the end of the session. So, Robin, you want to start with this one?
Sure. So I'm always asking myself, what do I really want out of my life? I'm routinely making this a part of my introspection. And I think that helps here, because a lot of times you get into these situations of analysis by paralysis for projects or issues that aren't all that important to that fundamental question of really how you want to be. So that's the first layer. The second layer is whatever you're being paralyzed by, then you ask yourself the question, is this issue or is this question critical to that particular project? And then is that project, how much does that project really tie into the way I want to live my life? And I think that very few issues get through those two layers and get to the point where I'm still confused, because they tease themselves out. This really isn't that important to what I want from the big picture of my life, or it's not really all that important to this particular project, in which case you just move forward. Now, when it does get through those layers and I'm still confused, then I seek a third opinion. And I do this in medicine, for example. That framework really works well for just life and business strategic decisions, but it also works well in medicine. Going back to the example of the CAT scan, not uncommonly we'll see something and we don't really know what it is, but we know that it's not aggressive. And that's really the most important thing. So we can sort of just discount it and move on, even though we haven't exactly identified what it is. Now, if you know that it's important and it's worrisome and it potentially could affect this person's life, then you need to address it appropriately and put some more effort into figuring out what it is. And if you're still stuck, then you go ask a trusted colleague. So that's my
I'm going to pause you there, because that's going to be my next question. When do you bring in other perspectives? So I just want to go down the line and see how others deal with analysis paralysis.
Okay, I'll jump in. And mostly to just add, this doesn't seem to be a problem for me. Personally, I think my bias is the opposite. I tend to make very hasty decisions. I've been lucky. I'm probably one of the luckiest people you know. So it's not a big problem for me. But I think for me, quickly sorting out what is urgent and what is important, and they're often very different. So make sure you're focused on something important. Important to your team, important to your business, important to the mission, as Robin said. And then just recognizing that you'll never get that last 20% of information and every answer to every question you need to make a perfect decision. You just have to be okay with being uncomfortable with that. Recognize again that important decisions don't get better by not being made.
In fact, Don, you just said something very important. There is a myth out there that if you take more time, you'll come to a better decision. That is not necessarily true, because you've used the word bias multiple times. So I want to highlight that word. All of us have biases, whether we know them or not. And it's great that you know your bias, that you make hasty decisions, because then you can be aware and vigilant towards it.
Right.
But so when you give more time, there is a catch there. You can actually amplify your bias and dig into those biases even stronger. So that is the downside of spending more time on a decision. Prashant?
Yeah, so you certainly don't want to look like a squirrel trying to cross a road, right? When making decisions. So you want to balance. There has to be a certain amount of analysis. Mainly because, when you have a decision in front of you, at least that's what I did. I used to weigh whether this decision that I make is a reversible decision, or it's something that once you make it, you cannot reverse it, right? So the consequences could be dire in those cases. So I certainly make that as a first sort of a evaluation. Is this a decision I can easily take back, or is this something I really need to think about, right? The second step is, of course, depending on the answer to that question, it is important to then say to yourself, okay, if this is not that critical, can I embrace uncertainty? Because it's not always, as I said before, it's not always possible to evaluate all the factors. And being an engineer, I'm very analytic, right? So I do tend to get into an analysis of every situation. But the way I resolved it when I was managing a large team was to do the analysis after the fact, right? So my itch to do analysis on a particular decision came after the fact, in the sense we did a lot of retrospectives, we did postmortems. So you make the decision, use intuition, judgment, good judgment, and try to make a decision, and then look at the consequences of those decisions in a postmortem, and then try to learn from that, right? That's how you build intuition as well. So that is what I try to practice. It's not always possible or easy to do, but that was a very conscious attempt that I made to do that all the time. So I got both, I was able to do my analysis as well as, hopefully made good decisions.
So what you did really was you had an intuitive judgment and then you verified after the fact as to the validity of that judgment. That's what I'm hearing.
Correct. So if things did not go very well with the decision, then we would evaluate as to what happened, why, where did we go wrong, and then learn from that experience. It was more of a learning opportunity and building intuition. And, there's a joke about this too, right? When you are in that situation where you cannot really make a decision and you're trying to drag yourself into an analysis type of situation, then you flip a coin, because when the coin is in the air, you know exactly what you're hoping for. And it comes out.
Interesting. In fact, I'm glad you brought the flipping of the coin, because a lot of times analysis paralysis starts when you have two good choices and you're trying to figure out which is the better one. Many people, especially the high achievers, we want the perfect. And I think Don alluded to perfection. So what is good enough? Because in the end, the difference between two good choices, if you spend days trying to figure it out, you're actually missing out on making that choice. And so flipping a coin, literally flipping a coin, would give you a decent answer because the two options are very, very close. So that I'm glad you brought up that flipping of the coin. So the other thing I want to talk about is high achievers tend to be focused, and because of our ability to focus and put our mind to something hyper focus, in fact, we're able to accomplish many things. But we know that when we are hyper focused, for those of you who've seen the gorilla video or any of that, where when you're asked to count the number of passes and you missed the big thing that have moved across the screen. So it's well known that tunnel vision happens when you're hyper focused. So how have you folks avoided tunnel vision when you are up against a major deadline or a big project or something that you are really hyper focused towards? Prashant, you want to go first?
Yeah, I can go first. So hyper focus or focus on any given situation can make you lose situational awareness, right? Which actually has an impact on how you make good decisions. So you have to be extremely careful about that. So in those situations, I always tended to, be very conscious to get other different perspectives because you're focused on a particular track. And there are other aspects that you want to bring into the picture, other perspectives. So you have to sort of, and you may not have time to do this, especially because we are talking about making decisions in the heat of the moment. But, getting other people's perspective doesn't necessarily mean that you have a meeting with 5 other people, because that could take time. It could be as simple as going online and trying to see what other people have done in situations like that. Especially because being an engineering leader, you not only have to make non-technical decisions, but sometimes you have to make technical decisions. And there's tons of information out there. I was in software development. There were standard patterns to certain decisions that were being made in how development should be done and things like that. So I used to always access, that repository of the body of knowledge that's out there. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to, access your colleagues or call a meeting, because that can take time. So definitely in those situations, try to delegate if you can to your colleagues to look at other aspects that you cannot focus on because you're focused on just one aspect of making a decision. So that was my approach.
That's a great idea, Prashant. Especially it might be delegating as simple things as, can you keep track of my email because I'm focused on this so that I don't miss something. And since you use the word situational awareness, which is a very, very military term, I'm going to ask Don to add some color to situational awareness.
Yeah, I was going to remark on that. Actually, I think that's very important, and I appreciate Prashant bringing that up. I'll tell you a little story. I'm a visual learner, so I find things that I want to work on or things that are important to me, and I try to make them visible to me. And I have a large family, and the kitchen is sort of the hub of activity of most families. It's also where the back door is, so I always keep a chalkboard or a whiteboard by the back door. And it just reminds me of something that I read, something that I saw, something that I want to internalize. And so for when I first put that up more than 20 years ago, the very first thing I put on the blackboard to remind myself was a quote that said, "The greatest danger in life is permitting the urgent things to crowd out the important things." Mm-hmm. And again, we can focus on things that are urgent and lose focus on things that are important. So sometimes those decisions we make under pressure are just urgent decisions. I think I try to sort that out. I recognize I have limited bandwidth, and I try to pay attention to what's important and focus on what's important. I think that's become increasingly more difficult, and I think young people struggle more than old people with it. There is so much urgent that's competing for our attention. Alerts, pings, badges, social media. You have to take control of the technology you're using. You have to engage when you choose to engage, focus on the things that are important, and get the other distractions out of the way. I think it's a huge problem right now for all of us, and we have to take control.
Absolutely. Thank you, Don. And Robin, since you were talking about second opinion, so to speak, I mean, you didn't use that exact term, but this would be a great time for you to chime in about when you get other people to chime in.
Yeah, they're two sort of separate things, but they kind of tie together. Your initial question, or your question here, was when you're hyper focused on something, you miss things, and how do you avoid that? So from the perspective of imaging, for example, let's use the example of looking at a CAT scan of the abdomen. You go and interrogate each one of these 100 different things that you're going to. And then if you don't go back and take a step back and look at the whole issue from, 60,000 feet or 2 feet, where, in the case of a monitor, you miss large things. Like, for example, wow, this patient's whole body is swollen. I didn't even notice that because I was looking at tiny little things. So in the world of imaging, I do that. I have multiple layers of analysis where I interrogate everything, and then I take a step back and look at the whole thing globally. And then when it comes to strategic sort of life decisions, business decisions, I'd like to create some kind of a framework to hang this particular thing in, and then look at that framework as a whole from a distance. And getting back to what you were saying earlier about when you bring in additional input from other people, it's really when it gets past those two layers. Number one, is this somehow affecting how I really want the large scale structure of my life to be? And then number two, is this particular question really going to affect this particular project? And I don't find that many things get through those layers, but when they do and something's equivocal, yeah, then you ask a trusted advisor.
Thank you very much. And since Don talked about being a visual learner, I'm going to change a visual and bring up the idea of how intelligent people we've always credited people with the phrase, oh, he's so smart, or he's so smart, or she's so smart. But as time came along, then EQ became a big thing. Oh, they need emotional intelligence as well. But in my 5.5 years of studying scandals, I discovered that everybody involved in a scandal had a high IQ and a high EQ. And that's how I kind of figured out that there must be a third intelligence that is missing, which is about judgment, because most people who get into trouble in a scandal and make headlines, it was mainly because of a lapse of judgment. So what I want to add, and and lapse of judgment comes in because of mainly you falling into a trap or you missing something. So just curious from your perspective, how do you folks deal with your blind spots? What kind of practices? I know each one of you has been super successful in your careers, and so far, I'm assuming that you've avoided a few blind spots. And how did you discover them? How do you go about avoiding them? Learning about them. And before I go there, Don, you used a beautiful phrase. You try to make the invisible visible. That's my entire work has been how to help CEOs and senior executives make things that are invisible to them visible so that then they have a choice to do something about them. So blind spots is the topic of this discussion now. And Robin, you want to go first?
Sure, it's a similar answer for me in terms of having a framework, right? Because if you have a framework and you look at whatever you're dealing with holistically, it helps you avoid those things that you miss when you're deep in the weeds. But then I'll give you a specific example of unrelated to the one that everyone's familiar with. Not uncommon. I'm not a big social media user, but not uncommonly I'll get on and I'll look at something and I have the tendency to put. I'll see something that's inflammatory and I'll just want to post back something. And then, so you get this paralysis thing. Do I really want to do this or I really don't? And then I'll have to take myself way back and I said, what do I want out of my life? Do I really want to be scrolling through all this garbage again and again and again? No. So I'll just shut it off. So I really think that perspective from a distance allows that.
Thank you. Prashant?
Yeah, so blind spots has a special meaning in my life because, when I was just getting into management, we had just gotten in an external consultant who talked about blind spots. And blind spots are extremely dangerous because, first of all, nobody tells you about them, right? Your subordinates they're not going to tell you about it. And your colleagues are just too nice and they won't tell you about it either. So it's a no-win situation because if you have those blind spots, some of them can be benign, right? And they're blind spot, they're benign. There can be other dangerous ones, right? Where you could have gender biases, you could have employee biases, you're making decisions based on that. And nobody tells you about these things because a blind spot, by definition, is something that you don't know about, right? And you're doing it all the time. And so I thought that was a very interesting lecture that this person, it was a workshop, actually, a whole day workshop that he came in and gave us this. And I thought this is very interesting. So, from then on, it was a struggle for me. But what I did was, and this helped me a lot, was to identify an accountability buddy, right? And you definitely don't want to pick. You want to pick the right person who can help you with that. So you don't want to pick your subordinate because they're not going to tell you, right? Or they'll always give you the good news. So in my case, it was my boss because he was a good friend of mine as well. And we had a deal, where I would be his accountability buddy and he would be mine. And we would openly, in our one-on-one meetings, tell each other if we are doing something wrong, And that was very helpful. I thought that was extremely helpful. I have a funny story to tell, actually. I had a presentation to make to the board where we are making some sweeping changes across the company. It was more like a culture change, development practices and things like that. So I had to convince the board to put a large amount of money in the budget to actually make that change happen and convince them, give them a path of how we are going to achieve that. It was a stressful presentation to make, right? So, and I usually don't do rehearsals on my presentations, but that was one of the few times when I did a rehearsal. And I actually, had my slide deck ready and I called my daughter, this is at home, and I said, you're going to tell me, I'm going to do this presentation. It was 25 minutes. And you're going to tell me if I sound confident, right? And if I sound convincing. Of course, I could not ask her for technical feedback on the presentation itself. So she was nice enough to do that, and she actually videotaped me. And at the end of the presentation, she said, "Daddy, do you know that when you raise and point your finger, you always raise your middle finger?" I said, "No way." There's no way I'm doing that. She said, "Look, it's on the video." And I looked at it, and there it was, right there. It was a blind spot for me. Now, in this case, you know, yeah, maybe, you know, it's important, but I fixed that habit right away, right?
That would have been a good
I,
message to the board. If you don't give them,
absolutely. Exactly. Exactly.
uh,
So I did not end up doing that in the actual board meeting, but it was very helpful to get that feedback.
Prashant, I think you touched on some absolutely wonderful points, but I'll make my comments after we hear Don. Don, what about you and blind spots?
So I think for me, the way I've avoided blind spots is two things. One, relying on building and relying on a strong team, and building and developing trust. So your team, really important for them to be diverse. They can't just look diverse. They have to be diverse. They have to have diverse thoughts, diverse ideas, diverse interests. That's important. And then that naturally covers a lot of the things that you don't think about, right? So diversity of the team. You know, for many years, I had the good fortune to run a hardware design and manufacturing company. And we worked on really hard problems. We built the largest telescope that's ever been built, had an almost 8.5 meter primary mirror, which had the aspect ratio of a potato chip. So every time you touched it or moved it, worked on it or tested it, you put it at great risk. So you realize when you do things like that, there are no superheroes. You really do rely on a team, a capable team, for system design, for integration, for all of those things. So you have to surround yourself with committed and competent people, and that's the basis of your team. You're responsible as a leader for making sure they understand the mission and the left and right boundary of what they're supposed to do. But then the next thing you have to do is listen to them and trust them. And that trust goes two ways, right? It's empowering to them, but when you're trusted by them, it's empowering to you. And to me, that counteracts any blind spots you must have.
Brilliant. Don, you touched upon something else in terms of superheroes. And Prashant, earlier you talked about postmortems. And when I do my workshops, I ask CEOs, how many of you give bonuses to people who prevent fires in your company? Most people give bonuses to firefighters, people who become heroes by solving a problem that's pretty visible. But fire preventers are the people who prevent fires from even showing up, which means they are solving the invisible. And most people are silent. And so there's a great construct called premortems. So when you start a project, you bring your team together, and do a premortem, which is asking them what are possible things that could go wrong. And then those who prevent those problems are also heroes, not just the ones who kind of show up and put out the fire in the moment. So that was one thing which I had not thought would come up, but that's why we have a diverse panel. Then coming back to your topic, Prashant, you were talking about blind spots are dangerous. Sure, they're dangerous, but there's good news and bad news about blind spot. Once you discover a blind spot, it's actually many times fairly easy to fix it. For example, your middle finger, turning your middle finger to your index finger would not take much, but once it's made visible to you, you're extremely conscious of it. Another thing that I was reminded of, and I think many of our fellow Indian subcontinent folks do, is we start every sentence with a no. And this is something that if you ask people, they'll say we don't do it. But there was one researcher who worked with me who said, Krishna, you start every sentence with a no, and that makes me feel negated the whole time. And it was pretty interesting once somebody points it out, how conscious you become about that particular thing. So engaging, and I always say, you said accountability partner. I have a little qualification on that, Prashant. It's pick a trusted well-wisher. not somebody evil, because they will kind of crucify you. So one of the executives I coached called me one day and said, "Hey, Krishna, could you inform me of some of my blind spots?" And it's not a pleasant conversation. It's usually embarrassing, right? So I said, I was trying to dodge the question when he gave me a layup and said, "Hey, I could call my wife, but that list would be too long." And so I was then given the permission to share one or two things. But having a good, trusted well-wisher, that's the key. Could be a mentor, could be a boss, but the trust, again, going back to Don's comment, it has to be a trusted relationship, and it's a truly, their comments are to benefit. That's why I call it a well-wisher. And anybody else with any other comments on this topic? Because I think blind spots are very, very important, because that's why I also call them traps. And high achievers tend to look for tips. We always want to do a little bit better. And I caution people, it's actually the traps that'll hurt you a whole lot more than any tip can help you. And the one example I have is, I'm assuming each one of you have played Snakes and Ladders or Shoots and Ladders, the game.
Mm-hmm.
What are high achievers looking for in that game?
Get to the top of the ladder.
Get to the top of the ladder. So, but I analyzed this game. Not that I have anything better to do, but in that game, I noticed that the average length of a snake or a chute is much longer than the average length of a ladder. And I always notice as people are rolling the dice, they're always counting the number to get a ladder and not saying, "Don't give me a number that'll get you down a snake." So that's the point. I've watched so many people play this game, and you're always looking for ladders when it's really the snake or the chute that can get you back down to the beginning almost. So that's something, the idea of how blind spots can hurt us. So I'm looking for questions, and since I don't see any, I'm going to go forward with our own questions, which is, so all this actually talks about impulsivity, right? I mean, when we are under pressure, there's usually that urgency, as Don, you mentioned, and Prashant, you started. The first thing you want to do is figure out which category does it belong to. So urgency is something that humans are trained to avoid. Urgent things, we attend to them because that's what kept us alive and we are here today. So that is something that's wired into us, to deal with the urgent. So it takes a level of conscious effort to avoid the urgent. So any ideas that you may have on how to be more conscious and less impulsive? How do each one of you do it? Maybe I'll give you a layup. The way I do it, actually, I use YouTube button. Every time I see the YouTube play button, I remind myself to pause, because that's a good, I see it enough times a day. So whenever I see a YouTube play button, I tell myself, take a pause, take a break. So like that, do each one of you have any reminders that you can share with the audience?
I'll share a technique that I started a few years ago. You know, as I mentioned before, I think I'm naturally an impulsive person. So I struggle with this idea of being present, being conscious all the time. So something I found very helpful in the past is just being quiet in the morning. I'm a morning person. I do deep work in the morning. And so there's a tendency when I get out of bed to immediately want to jump into my work. And that's very fulfilling, right? Because that's when I'm most vibrant and alive, and I feel like I'm very productive that time of day. But what I learned that while that can be really rewarding, if I spend that first 10 to 15 minutes just in quiet, it changes my mood, I guess, throughout the day. And I can still be productive then when I do start work, but I spend some time before I look at the news. I used to grab the newspaper as soon as I woke up. And then after that, it was news on my device. But if I find that if I just sit quietly for 10 to 15 minutes, that's really all it takes, then I can still dive into my work. But I do it with just a different feeling about me, a different focus, a different energy. The other two things that really are hugely important to me is getting outside and getting exercise. And for me, exercise for the sake of just getting exercise, it doesn't do it. I sort of have to have an objective. So I find myself signing up for all sorts of events that I've never done before to force me to be focused on a goal and to achieve some physical goal for an event that forces me into exercise every day. So those are the things I use.
Perfect. Thank you, Don. We have one question. So if once we go through quickly, Prashant and you, we'll take the question as well. Yeah.
Yeah, so I'll quickly add to that. I think what's important here is, I completely agree with what Don said. I do practice meditation that helps a lot, to grounding yourself. Silence is also important to practice. That way, when you're in situations where you need to make quick decisions, and it's important to also distinguish between intuition and impulsivity, right? They are two different things. Although from the outside, they may seem like they're a person making a decision very intuitively, very quickly may appear to be impulsive, but they're not, right? So I think it's important to make that distinction. And it's also two other things. One is I take deep breaths when I'm in a situation where I feel like I should make some decision. Like, there's somebody in your office, ranting about something, and you want to make sure you say the right thing and you don't offend the person, you're listening. So how do you stop yourself from reacting in a way that could make the situation worse, right? Taking deep breaths helps a lot, right? So it's sort of like your YouTube button, right? And also the other thing is responsibility. So my definition of responsibility is the ability to respond, right? It doesn't necessarily mean that you're taking the blame. So it's your ability to respond. So if you're impulsive to respond, that's actually a good thing. You're not making a decision, but you're responding. So if there's a white elephant in the room, nobody's saying anything, you'll be the first one to address that issue. And then, mobilize the forces to make that decision.
Looks like we're running out of time. So I want quickly,
okay,
Robin,
go ahead.
Robin, why don't you talk about yours and then we'll take that quick question.
Two things. So number one, turn off all notifications on every device all the time, every time. I've done that. And number two is, getting back to what Prashant said, meditation and breathing is a part of that. My problem with that has always been, it's hard to get into that frame of mind when you're sort of, frantic and chaotic to begin with. And so what's helped me with that is an app called Headspace. And so pick your favorite meditation app. But for me, that one is just terrific. They have short, brief meditations, and it's been shown that it's not the duration of the meditation, but it's more the frequency and how long you're getting yourself into those tranquil states. And I'll pause there.
Wow.
I've used that one. It's really good. Yeah.
As president of Mindful Nation Foundation, I'm thrilled that all three of you talked about it and I can skip it. And we have one question from Nancy. She says, have you guys used she uses the DISC personality insights assessment. One of the questions is, do you folks use assessments? And I can quickly say, yes, I do, many kinds. So what about you guys?
I have to some extent, but rather than the DISC, which I'm familiar with, I try to use the 6 needs, the Maslow's needs, because that gives you more insights into how people make decisions because they're trying to meet their needs. So basically, of the 6 needs, uncertainty, certainty, significance, growth, contribution, and love, which are the top 2 that is driving them, because that makes a whole lot of difference in how people make decisions because they're trying to meet those needs. And once you understand them, as to how the other person is making their decisions and what their needs are, then you can respond to them accordingly.
Don?
Yeah, I am familiar with DISC and have used a variety of different similar programs in the past, and find it very important not only to know yourself but to know others.
Yes. In fact, I use multiple of them because each one looks at it from one lens, and I use actually 4 of them. So go ahead, Robin.
I have a lot to learn about this topic and not much to add.
All right. And the last question is, any books that you may suggest on this topic?
Oh, wow. Yeah, I guess I can recommend a book. The author's name escapes me. It's a book about General David Petraeus, and it's about decision making. And the name of the book is Tell Me How This Ends, which is apparently a famous question he used to ask his teams when they proposed a particular plan. And he would ask them to sort of forecast what will be the outcome with the question, Tell me how this ends.
Interesting. And since it's a book, so my work is captured, some of my work is captured in my book titled Beyond the Pig and the Ape, where pig and ape are acronyms for pursuing instant gratification, and the ape is avoiding painful experiences, which if you're not vigilant to, will make most of our choices for us. Anybody else? So Anil?
Yeah, I think the book Blink is also very interesting by Malcolm Gladwell, and it tells us about how we make judgments. So it's pretty cool.
Actually, Prashant, I'm glad you brought that up, and you used the word intuition. So gut can be both instinct and intuition, and it can be both. So I always look at, to differentiate between, is it a gut instinct or intuition? You look at the energy behind it. If there is fear, if there's anxiety, most likely it's a gut-related thing from an instinct because you're trying to survive, whereas intuition has more calmness behind it.
Right. Interesting. Yeah.
So thank you again. I actually, the reason why I went last on these questions is because I wanted to learn from you too. And it's so beautiful that we are not only friends, we are also aligned, coming from very different perspectives on this topic. So thank you all. And Anil, I'm handing over the baton to you.
Thank you, Krishna, and thank you all so much. I learned so many tips. Thanks so much. It was really, wow, powerful, very powerful. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you
Thanks
all.
for having
Have
us.
a great day.